sir. Market research shows people see you as something of an ogre. Club them and eat their bones.
Hey, good morning, guys. Today we're going to wrap up our Totalitarian Leaders chapter. And today we're going to talk about probably two of the most infamous totalitarian leaders in all of world history. Now, the first guy we're going to discuss is going to be Joseph Stalin, who we're a little bit familiar with from dealing with the Bolshevik revolutions and kind of the rise of communism under Lenin in what will become the Soviet Union. But Stalin is kind of a little bit of a misunderstood man in general. Now, as we talked about with Mussolini, Mussolini's kind of fascist ideas are driven by his experience in World War I. Stalin is much more extreme. Now, while he is a believer in communism, he's going to kind of have a little bit of a warped sense of reality when it comes to what communism is and what it actually can effectively create. So this is kind of where that misunderstanding where kind of these dictator-like individuals are always communist and communists are always dictators. Stalin is the person, all right, that kind of creates that warped sensibility. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of those misconceptions as we get a little deeper into this.
You're an inspiration for birth control.
All right, so Stalin, as we know, was kind of one of the first right-hand men of Lenin. Now, when Lenin does rise to power in the Soviet Union, obviously we know that it's Stalin, it's Trotsky, that are both kind of neck and neck to be the heirs to the throne when Lenin does kind of move on. When Lenin dies, obviously Stalin kind of creates his little, I guess you want to say, coup d'etat, eliminating all of Lenin's facilitators and all of his supporters, and Trotsky was one of them. So that was kind of how Stalin originally takes control. But Stalin doesn't stop there. Stalin knows that he has to eliminate all threats, both foreign and domestic, so inside the Soviet Union as well as outside the Soviet Union, that can in some way weaken his power structure. He's basically trying to unify all control of the Communist Party, all control of the Soviet Union in his hands and only under his control. So the first big way that he's able to do that is by eliminating as much private property as possible. And this is known as his 5-year plan. Now, basically, in general terms, what he was aiming to do was to turn the Soviet Union into some sort of massive scale, large industrial nation. So he's basically moving away from the agrarian society that had always been kind of the Russian way of life, farming, village to village kind of trade. And he wanted to basically start to turn the Soviet Union into this, I almost want to say, colossus of industrial power. Now, this is going to be accomplished, but it's going to come at a very, very high cost, both financially as well as a great cost of life. All right, roughly a quarter of his population are going to die in the first 10 years of his reign, both from starvation because of the whole communist equal representation and equal distribution of wealth, as well as him overworking and eliminating any type of political oppositions. All right, so the Soviet Union is going to become a police state that are mainly controlled by his secret police force, the Cheka. Now, the Cheka are going to be responsible for what is known as the Great Purge. And this was just basically to get rid of any type of opposition that Stalin had. Now, millions are going to die of starvation. Now, there's a wide range of estimations as to how many people actually die under Stalin's rule. We don't really have a firm number because, as we know, a lot of these things are going to be whitewashed. They're going to be sanitized. And as we've seen with some more modern dictatorial states, all right, there's a lot of what we would kind of consider propagandized or just simply put, almost like hermetically sealed information. All right, basically everything is censored to a T. So the Soviet Union under Stalin, it kind of ventures away from the original Communist Manifesto that was written by Marx. Marx clearly states that communism is just a stopgap from one type of economic system to another. All right, it's eventually supposed to be how you pick yourself up by your bootstraps, how you get off of rock bottom. All right, you eliminate all of the excess, and then you start to slowly scaffold from there. All right, so under Marx's idea, basically says, you're going to transition to something else, and that communism will eventually wither away any place that you put it into play. Stalin does not believe in that. In fact, under Stalin, the Soviet Union, the opposite occurs. All right, he transitions the Soviet Union without necessarily saying that he's doing it. He transitions them into a more totalitarian, almost like command economy, where it has some of the semblance of communism, but in reality, all right, it's more of just a big, powerful, complex bureaucracy where he and his elite inner circle are controlling all decisions, and they're obviously going to be the ones that are benefiting wealth-wise. So one of the big ways that he does this command economy is he creates what is known as collectivization. All right, basically, he's going to take peasants' land, he's going to take all of those things and turn them into state-owned farms, but then more importantly, he is going to not only force them, all right, to give up their lands, but he's also going to, in many cases, almost like thin the herd. And he does this by killing farm animals, by destroying tools, by burning crops. He wants to control the amount of output that his country can create. So basically, he doesn't want to have such a large investment in agriculture. He wants to transition that investment into industry. So while it seems really maniacal and crazy that he's going to burn fields and kill farm animals and, eliminate those things, it was all kind of not necessarily a gentle nudge, but it's a very firm push for his people to become more industrialized. Now, while he does it through violence, and that's not necessarily a good thing, right, he does achieve his plan pretty quickly because he forces them to do so. Now, the big opposition to this collectivization are the very wealthy farmers and wealthy landowners known as the kulaks. Now, the kulaks were his biggest adversary because they had a little bit of clout and a little bit of financial wealth behind them. So during the Great Purge, one of his kind of sideshow / secondary goals was to liquidate the entire class of kulaks. Basically, we are going to eliminate them. We're going to kill them if we can, and if not, we're going to force them into these work camps, these very, very intense, brutal labor camps known as the gulags. Thousands are going to be killed. Many of them are going to disappear to the work camps in Siberia and as well as out into eastern Russia, never to be heard from again. And we'll see kind of that theme of if you oppose Stalin, you end up in a work camp or you end up in a death camp fairly short after. Right? He's not afraid to pull the trigger in many senses of the word to get rid of anybody, all right, that stands against him. All right, and that kind of fear mentality is known as the terror famine. All right, so even after he's eliminated all these oppositions, all right, we start to see that he's consolidating to make sure that his ruthless policies are not questioned, as well as his supremacy is not in any way in danger. All right, and this actually becomes a little bit more intense as the rest of the world is going through the Great Depression. All right, we see, like, for instance, in 1932, and you combine the Great Depression with poor harvest and terrible famine, you're going to see more of your own countrymen dying. Now, in many cases, we would look at that as a big catastrophe. Stalin does not, because he doesn't have the resources to actually sustain his own people anyways. So he needed kind of almost like a mass exodus of people, whether they were leaving through immigration or whether they were dying from, starvation or overwork, whatever it was. All right, so he didn't really blink an eye, all right, to the massive decline of the amount of people that he had. All right, the way he looked at it is the people that were surviving were the ones he wanted them to survive. They were the specialized skills individuals that were going to continue to push the Soviet Union forward, all right, and they were going to strive for success while the non-essential people, all right, would kind of wither away and die. All right, this was his way of almost like pruning the rose bush. It was some of the words he used to use. All right, so feeding the population would remain a problem in the Soviet Union all the way until its fall in the early 1990s. All right, so this isn't something that's just going to go away, all right, but it's something that the leadership of the Soviet Union tended to turn a blind eye to. All right, as long as the people that mattered were comfortable, wealthy, had what they need, that's all that really mattered. The basic peasantry, the powers that be really could care less. All right, so as we talked about, there's going to be heavy use of the secret police. In some cases, we would call it the Cheka. In other cases, it was specialized, kind of like special ops missions. But torture, violence, all of those things are used to ensure obedience. All right, he even wants to stamp out any type of loyalty to the former Bolsheviks through anybody that stood with Lenin. Basically, he wanted to have only the supporters and loyalists to him within the Communist Party. All right, so he's going to get rid of any dissent amongst the communist elite. all the way through his reign, and even through transitions into other Soviet leaders like Gorbachev, like Khrushchev. All right, they use some of the semblance, but they become a little bit more modernized as the tactics that Stalin used become outdated and archaic. So with the Great Purge, kind of on the tail end of the Great Purge, what we see is that those elimination of the old Bolsheviks, the people that were loyal to Lenin, all right, kind of almost ends the Great Purge in a crescendo. All right, he widens his net to include anybody that had some social power. So that included any military leaders, army heroes, industrial managers, anybody that could have a voice that could, in some shape or fashion, rise above the generalized white noise of the peasantry. So basically anybody that had some influence, right, that contradicted or even said a crossword about Stalin or the Soviets or the Communist Party of his nature, they were gone. All right, and a lot of the ways that they got away with this was by staging these show trials where the outcome was already predestined, and many of these people, all right, would be basically being sent to their deaths, whether sent to the death camps, whether they're executed on the spot. All right, and these show trials were all about kind of once again ensuring obedience amongst the people. All right, now, as we start to see communism moving away from and more of the totalitarian bureaucracy that Stalin imposes in the mid-30s, we also start to see that propaganda becomes very, very important. Other totalitarian leaders and dictators are going to use this almost to a T. Hitler and the Nazi Party are genius for the way they use propagandized stuff and brainwashing in a number of different ways, whether it was using Goebbels in his spinning of the truth, or whether it was the creation of the Hitler Youth, where they were indoctrinating as many of the younger generations as possible. It was all about getting the masses to not necessarily even second guess anything. So one of the ways that Stalin does this is through what is known as the Pravda, all right, and that was his main conduit of a lot of this propagandized news. It was a Communist Party newspaper. It was the only newspaper that was circulated in the Soviet Union, so it really greatly limits what the peasants know and what they're actually having access to when it comes to information. All right, so most of Stalin's ideas are all about not only spreading his ideals, but also spreading his ideals to other nations. So his main attempt to do that, to spread the Russian culture beyond just the politics, was through what was known as Russification. Basically, in a nutshell, it was all about, we want to make our peers and make our allies more Russian. So that meant you needed to act like a Russian, talk like a Russian, believe what a Russian believes. All right, and all of that kind of comes as a part of your loyalty to the Soviet Union. One of the big things that he does is he eliminates organized religion. All right, effectively, the Communist Party destroys religious faith in not only the Soviet Union, but all of the Soviet satellite nations by enforcing what is now known as atheism, or the lack of a belief of a higher power. All right. Now, it wasn't that Stalin was anti-religion, but he believed that religion gets in the way of your loyalty to the state. So that's one of the big misconceptions. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God or that he didn't have a belief in a higher power. He wanted to eliminate any distractions. And he felt, Stalin felt that religion was the biggest distraction to loyalty to the nation. And this new elite under his reign is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And as we know, being a member of his inner circle and his elite class had great privileges, but it also puts a big target on your back because you gain notoriety, you gain influence, and then that starts to rival what Stalin stands for. So if you rose too fast through the social classes, you basically go from friend, all right, to massive foe. All right, so even though we were insisting that classlessness in the Soviet Union was happening, all right, that big kind of bureaucracy of the Soviet Union did just that. It created very, very stratified social classes. You had Stalin in the inner circle that were very, very wealthy, very, very powerful. Then you had the wealthy industrialists that were vital, whether it was the energy, whether it was the industrial capacity, whether it was the manufacturers, whether it was, maybe some of the diplomats. All right, all of those different things have importance as we move into not only the 20th century, but as we're setting the stage for the 21st century. All right, so the foreign policy is really, really muddled. That's not really something that we're able to kind of discuss, in one single sitting. When we get to the Cold War, we'll talk more about kind of how the Soviet Union's conflicting foreign policy really comes up. All right, but the same basic mindset of spreading communism as far and as wide as possible still exists. They just go about it in a little bit of a different way. All right, whether it's through kind of expanding the Comintern, as we talked about with the Chinese civil wars, all right, but also kind of using propaganda to almost like create this mistrust in Western powers. It was creating that storyline of democracy, basically the United States and Great Britain against the Soviets, against the Chinese, and eventually against some of those other small nations that will align themselves with the Soviets moving forward, like Cuba, like North Korea, even getting into some of the things in Indochina, like with the Vietnam War and Cambodia and Laos, and figures like Pol Pot, or probably a little bit more of a familiar figure, Ho Chi Minh, leading kind of those nationalist groups throughout Southeast Asia. All right, so even though the Soviet Union is slowly kind of winning recognition from the Western powers, and they increase their trade capital and their trade influence, the West is very, very leery of Stalin, because they realize that he is, a very, very short fuse type of individual. He could easily fly off the handle and make a mess of a situation in no time flat. Hitler, on the other hand, Hitler is singularly driven. All right, and the rise of the Nazi Empire is extremely important, because when you look at Adolf Hitler and his rise through World War I, and his very, very devout belief in what Germany and what kind of the honorable German should look like, all right, he kind of creates that warped sense of reality. Now, the National Workers' Party of Germany, as we know, all right, is really kind of hell-bent on returning Germany to the rarefied air as a world power. All right, they believed that the humiliation of World War I, all right, was just a sign of weakness of the leadership, and Hitler wanted to basically eliminate that weakness and reinsert that powerful German mentality and personality back onto the global stage. So as we know, Hitler was not born in Germany. He was originally native to Austria, but as a part of kind of the German conscription, he was able to volunteer for the German army when the Austrians had turned him down, and that makes him very loyal to his adopted nation. So when World War I broke out, Hitler joined that German army and was a highly decorated soldier within the war. Right? Even though he was small in stature, right, he was willing to take on some very risky missions, and deserves a little bit of credibility for the bravery and the military strategy that he kind of uses throughout his rise through the military in World War I. Now, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany didn't originate as an intimidating force, but that they kind of absorb that feeling throughout their rise. What originally kind of began with the beer hall riots, or the beer hall putsch, was kind of just the stepping stone of the Nazi Party coming to be. All right. Some of these issues Hitler had to take into his own hand and had to take through force, but he was more skilled at outmaneuvering his opposition politically. All right. And we'll see that through a number of different movements, whether it's, the Reichstag fires, whether it's the Night of Long Knives, where he effectively eliminates and assassinates all of his political opposition in one fatal swoop in one evening to take over the entirety of the German government. All right, but Hitler joining the Nazi Party is just kind of one step of many steps, all right, of his rise to political and world power. All right, and as we know, all right, Hitler is going to kind of generate a lot of kind of like almost like religious-like followers that become extremely loyal to him. Now, while he's not a religious figure, right, he kind of had that almost like that it factor, right? And many people attribute the very, very loyal followers that he had to his great speaking skills. Hitler right, wrong, or indifferent, was an extremely good public speaker. He was an extremely good orator. All right, so he had the ability to influence people, and in today's day and age, all right, he would be typically kind of like associated, kind of like a televangelist. All right, he was a person that could motivate. All right, he was kind of that rah individual that could get, had a pulse of what the people wanted to hear and who they were and what they wanted to do moving forward. All right, so this group, the Nazi Party, absorbs some of those mentalities with him as the leader. All right, so as they gain notoriety, he gains notoriety, and as he gains notoriety, it gains more notoriety. So it's a kind of a constant positive feedback loop. All right, so as we talked about, the National Socialist German Workers' Party is the official name for the Nazi Party. We just typically shorten it and call it, the Nazi Party for short. Now, while this is considered socialism, the only thing socialist about the Nazi Party, all right, is the desire for the government to run the economy. Otherwise, this is straight up totalitarian dictatorship. All right. Now, Hitler didn't necessarily view it that way. He felt that he was kind of doing things for the good of Germany, but as he accumulates more and more power and more influence, he does kind of get a little drunk on that power. And actually, not a little bit, a lot of it drunk on the power. And that's where kind of the wheels start to fall off with his regime in the Third Reich. Now, the stormtroopers become kind of the specialized individuals within not only the Nazi Party, but eventually the German military. All right, we had the stormtroopers, which are also known as the brown shirts, or what kind of the typical average person calls the SS. All right, this was the specialized soldiers. This was the best of the best. These were kind of like the commandos of the Nazi military. And with the SS, they were highly trained, highly motivated, and they were beyond just indoctrinated. They were almost propagandized to do and to not question any type of military orders coming from the Führer or the leader, which is Hitler. Now, this isn't all going to be success for Hitler. Hitler goes through some periods of, crash and burns. All right. One of the great examples is the failed attempt to overthrow the German government during kind of the 1920s, known as the Beer Hall riots or the Beer Hall Putsch. All right, where he tried to go in with a couple of handguns and some, I guess we want to say locked and loaded individuals, and they were humiliated when, this political gathering shot back at him. And he lost a number of his kind of inner circle in this firefight that eventually involves him being arrested and thrown into prison for a short period of time. Now, while Hitler is in prison, this is where we really start to see him develop that persona that we are familiar with when it comes to his impact on World War II and even beyond post-mortem. Now, during his prison stay, right, he kind of reorganizes his thoughts and really puts a concrete objective out there, right? And that is what's going to come out of his, I guess you want to say, penned works known as Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, right? And in this book, in this manifesto, it contained not only his plan of government, but also his racist ideas of anti-Semitism and the Germans as a master race, as well as what he envisioned for Germany moving forward. Right? And it was worded in a way that was highly motivating and highly volatile, but it was what the Germans wanted to hear at that point in time. Right? Because of Mein Kampf and its supreme, if you want to say notoriety, if you want to say popularity, right? It was seen and heard and spread throughout the German people as well as around the world. One of the unique facts about Mein Kampf was on the New York bestseller list for many, many, many decades after Hitler's death, right? Which is an extremely kind of mind-blowing fact. Now, obviously, there's a lot of manipulation when it comes to kind of counting those numbers, but the bottom line is, it was a pretty notorious text work, literature work throughout the 20th century, and it still to this day is something that as taboo as it may seem, is still accessible for the masses. And it really kind of puts a spotlight, or maybe even a magnifying glass, on how Hitler saw the world and what his very, very, what we view as sinister now, but very, very powerful plan was at that point in time. As we talked about, Hitler was able to spread his ideas through his great orator skills, and his goals for Germany were ones that talked about returning Germany to power. We're talking about, lifting Germany out of the depression and the suffering and all of the things that had really doomed them since the end of World War I. All right, and Hitler also understood that communism was a huge threat to his, I guess you want to say, party rule, as well as the future of Germany. So this was kind of the alternative to communism. You had kind of on one side of the coin people that were supportive of that equal wealth, classless society of communism, and then you had kind of the industrialists that were trying to protect what little wealth they had in power by really kind of taking a death grip on the economy and the government and wealth and power through, very, very stratified social systems. Hitler and fascism is the polar opposite of Stalin and communism. All right. Well, now, while we always group those two together, they couldn't be farther apart on the political spectrum when it comes to how they go about their business. So naturally, fascism in general supports the upper class, supports the industrialists. It's everything that communism is not. All right. And by doing that, you're going to have a lot of support from not only the wealthy industrialists, but also the people that are kind of the inventors, the up-and-comers, the social climbers, which is a big, big draw to why the Nazis were able to not only become the largest party in Germany, but the fastest growing political party in Germany, a country that had not just one or two political viewpoints, but, 10s, 20s, 30s political parties. All right. So even though they were the largest party, they weren't necessarily the majority. They didn't have over half the population in their hip pocket. That will soon change as Hitler eliminates opposition, meaning other political parties. All right. And one of the things that he does is he slowly climbs the ranks in the government as an elected official. And then when he seizes an opportunity, i.e., he sees a moment of weakness by Germany's president in 1933, Hindenburg, he starts to enact some of his plans. And one of that was the appearance of communists bombing the Reichstag, or the legislature of the German government. He basically wanted to create his own little Red Scare in Germany to get those individuals that were on the fence about whether they wanted to be supporters of the Nazi Party or supporters of communism. They wanted to swing them to become the majority of the population. Therefore, Hitler could rise even farther. Eventually, he could take over the entire government. And once he had procured all of those positions of power, he could centralize himself, and he can eliminate anybody else from, getting in the way, basically. All right. And when he's able to kind of orchestrate that sham communist, I guess you want to say, rouge, that's when Hitler kind of seizes the opportunity. So with the Reichstag fires, he's able to procure all these seats in the Reichstag within the legislature. He kind of positions himself to lead not only the Reichstag, but eventually be elected as the leader of Germany. And then he consolidates and declares himself the Führer, which is the leader of not only Germany, but also all of the German allies. All right, that's where some of those smaller nations like Austria, when it does come time for World War II, all right, they so easily kind of blend in with the Germans, is because, well, they not only had kind of the long-term history and partnership there, but they also saw, the type of influence that Hitler had. All right, they didn't really have much of a choice other than to side with Hitler. Now, they didn't really second guess the whole idea of joining forces with Hitler, but it really wasn't a choice they really actually had. All right, and one of the biggest ways that he procures all of this power after the Reichstag fire is by being able to pass the political act known as the Enabling Act. All right, and what the Enabling Act pretty clearly does is it consolidates all power in all powers, meaning the ability to make decisions, all right, into Hitler's hands, right, where basically he has veto power over everything, and he doesn't have to actually get approval from the legislature, all right, to enact any type of law or plan. All right, so this effectively allows Hitler to declare not only laws without getting approval, but it also makes Hitler a dictator, politically and economically. Many people view the Reichstag fire as the biggest thing that he's able to pass, and the biggest kind of, I guess you want to say, feather in his cap. That's wrong. The biggest thing that he is able to pass, that has the biggest impact on his power, is the Enabling Act. There, bar none. Had he not been able to do that and had the Enabling Act pass, none of his militarization of Germany actually happens, and we probably don't see nearly the type of pushback that Hitler is able to enforce going into World War II. All right, and as a part of that, he also bans all competing parties, so he's eliminating opposition. He uses the secret police and the Gestapo to put down all political opposition. All right, we know with the Night of Long Knives, anybody that was outspoken against him in the government ranks, they were executed, they were assassinated in a number of different ways, and he actually does this and orchestrates this in one night. This is one of those things it's kind of a very unique situation, kind of like Stalin's Great Purge. All right, Hitler was doing the same similar thing to his own political adversaries. All right, and this is where he kind of pushes the envelope by kind of enforcing the next phase of his political strategies with, really targeting the Jews and putting a lot of blame on the Jews with anti-Semitism and trying to reallocate a lot of those German territories that were taken during World War I. He basically wants to blame the Jews as the scapegoat for all of Germany's problems, the depression, losing World War I, all of the above. And he works his people up into, a pretty intense froth and sets them free. All right, and he allows his own population to kind of self-police themselves. All right, he creates the message, and then he doesn't allow for any type of opposition to that message. And lastly, as we start to see the Nazis really accumulating power, all right, they enact the Nuremberg laws, which deprive the Jews of citizenship and political rights, and we start to see them not only having to wear the marks of the sign of Star of David, but also these movements are all starting to work towards physical, accusations, physical accosting, and eventually the creation of the ghettos, creation of what eventually becomes the concentration camps and the extermination camps that are all very familiar with us dealing with the Holocaust. All right, and all of this kind of reaches a boiling point on the night of 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where the Nazi mobs loot these Jewish shops, burn the synagogues, beat the Jews in the streets, and basically make it very clear to get out of the country, get out of Europe, leave now, all right, because you're not going to get another opportunity. We look at the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, as kind of that starting point for the final solution. All right, this was the last chance for the Jewish population to be able to get out of Germany with their lives and with themselves intact while they could, because soon after this, we see the borders close. We see the Jewish population being rounded up, put on trains, these concentration camps, these extermination camps, and the ghettos throughout Eastern Europe. All right, whether it was the ghettos in Poland, whether it was the concentration camps like Auschwitz, like Dachau, like Buchenwald, or we're even getting to just pure extermination camps where there wasn't much housing. You just simply got into your line, your queue, and you walked right into the crematoriums, and they either gassed you, they burnt you, they did all of those very, very volatile execution methods. All right, and a big part of that was the indoctrination. The Nazi youth, Hitler's youth, was a big kind of focal point for indoctrinating the future, and Hitler's idea was, if I can start the people of Germany young in these very radicalized beliefs, then eventually I wouldn't have to do anything. They would indoctrinate their children. So within one generation, you would go from kind of a moderate population to an extremist population that doesn't question any of the Nazi, methods or any of the Nazi propagandized, political plans. All right, and as we get into World War II, we'll start talking a little bit about Japan and how kind of they become involved in the Axis powers, but they really don't belong when we talk about totalitarian leaders yet. They will, but not at this point, not until they become so militarized and so driven that they start to almost like, I guess you want to say, assimilate to some of their fellow alliance members in the Axis powers. And we'll talk more about that when we deal with World War II in the coming weeks. So as you guys kind of wrap this up, please review those slides dealing with Mussolini, with Stalin, and with Hitler. And then when you feel comfortable, please do take that totalitarian leader quiz on the Google Forms that's attached. Otherwise, have a great week. I'll be back in contact with you guys on Wednesday. Stay safe, wash your hands, wash your butt, get some fresh air, and we'll talk to you soon.